Thank you so much for coming to our webinar today on best practices for a secure network infrastructure. A couple housekeeping rules. Please be sure to put your questions in the questions box on the GoToWebinar tool. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will answer those questions, but after the webinar, we will be emailing everybody a copy of the recording as well as the slides. Without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce Paul Caiazzo. He's the co-founder and chief security architect here at TruShield Security Solutions. Paul brings with him more than 15 years of experience in the information security industry, as well as a master's degree in information security and assurance. As one of the key members of TruShield's business development team, Paul is responsible for developing the corporate strategy and leading the technical product and service development efforts. Paul also has extensive experience in consulting and working with high-level executives at large corporations and government, advising them on all things cybersecurity related. So with that, I'll give the microphone over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Tony. So as Tony said, I've got quite a bit of experience deploying secure networks, and so that's really what we're going to be talking about today. What comprises a secure network? What are some best practices to build a secure network architecture? Are there any security controls which benefit from deploying your network correctly, and are there some which can be really disrupted by deploying an insecure network? So we'll dive deep into all of those questions. One thing I'd like to point out, my information is on the slide there, so if you have questions about what we're going to talk about today, I invite you to please reach out to me either via email or please also, if you'd like, connect with me on LinkedIn. One of the things that we do typically on LinkedIn is share out threat advisories, and that's a great way to keep informed about stuff that's going on over here at TruShield. So a little bit of background about who we are. So we are a global cybersecurity company. We're based in the Washington, D.C. area, but we've got clients around the world. We provide what we call concierge security services. So very high touch, interact with our clients very deeply so that they get a very good understanding of us, we get a very good understanding of them, and we're able to help them maximize their spend in security. We work within a couple of key realms, mostly within professional services and managed services. Professional services really comes down to consulting, security architecture, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, and things like that. And by virtue of having done that since the company's founding, almost 8 years ago, we know a lot about what works and what doesn't with respect to security architecture. And all of that stuff actually enables us to offer the managed services that we offer in a way that is most effective for our client organizations. And so we're going to talk about what we've seen in terms of what pitfalls are common to fall into and how we can help you guys avoid them when you're deploying networks in your own organizations. So an agenda of what we'll talk about today. First off, we're going to talk about why it even matters that the secure infrastructure is deployed correctly. We're going to talk about what goes into developing a good secure inventory, systems inventory, and how to do systems administration securely. And then we'll dive deep into that. What are the characteristics of a secure network infrastructure? So again, we're going to start with why the secure network infrastructure matter. If you think about it, the network really is the foundation, right? Your entire business really leverages all of your technology. Your investment in technology is what helps you achieve your business goals. If you think about, regardless of what sort of organization you are, if you're a federal organization or you're a bank or a credit union or a law firm, it doesn't really matter. You've got some business objective. You've invested in technology to help you accomplish that objective. And if you don't invest that correctly, or if you don't deploy that technology that you've purchased in the right way, you can actually end up doing yourself a lot more harm than good. Like we say, there are cracks in that foundation can bring down the whole house. So you may have invested quite a bit of money into your network, but if you don't deploy it correctly, if you don't layer security into each level of that network, it's going to end up being something of a wasted expense. And if not a wasted expense, it's not going to be as effective as what it could be at what your goal is, which is really securing your business and making sure that you can operate in a manner that you know exactly what's happening in your network and you can control access to your sensitive information. So where do we begin with this? My opinion, and this is backed up by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, where you really have to start is identifying the systems that are on your network. You've got to be able to, in real time or very close to real time, be able to detect and identify what machines are connected to your network at any given point in time. In addition to the machines that are on your network, you really also need to be able to detect what people are on your network. So those of you out in the audience, if you think about as you engage with maybe vendors or service providers that come into your environment, do you allow them to just plug their network or their devices into your network? If so, that's probably a practice which we would advise against, because that puts you into a kind of an unknown state. You're not really able to determine how secure that asset is. And so that asset inventory really becomes that security database of what devices are connected to my network, what software is installed on them, how is that hardware configured, and all of that information will help you build that database which describes your security posture. And it's really important to be able to do that because the vast majority of data breaches are through that insider threat. Maybe not always malicious insiders, but in fact a lot of times it can just simply come down to mistakes or ignorance that an employee might make on your network. Those can, if you're not adequately prepared and adequately configured to contain that sort of thing, it can result in a really serious incident that secure network actually could have stopped for you without even any additional controls on that. So what else does an inventory allow you to do? Well, one thing which is somewhat more advanced that perhaps some of you guys out in the audience haven't deployed in your environment is port security. Port security is the enablement of locking down your network switch infrastructure so that only certain devices can connect to your network. The way this is done is via the MAC address of the network interface card on the device itself, and your switches will allow you to configure the set of MAC addresses that are allowed to connect to it. So a specific port, let's say take the example there, PCD is connected to switch port 1. That device has a MAC address associated with it. That switch can be configured to only allow that MAC address to connect to that port. That will enable you to limit the types of machines that are connecting to your network so that a rogue employee can't bring in some misconfigured or malicious device and plug it into your network and do whatever they want on it. That enables you to really lock down what sort of devices are allowed in your network, and it really gives you that hardware asset control. It gives you an ability to prevent those new devices from being introduced to your network and introducing new security risks as well. The other thing that actually powers, if you kind of work backwards from an incident. So if you experience a security incident and you are fortunate enough to have been doing adequate log management, and you look back into your logs, you can perhaps find the IP address that's the source of that particular security incident. Armed with port security, you can then go to the switch port that device is connected to and immediately just take it off the network. Without having that port security and without really knowing where devices are plugged into your network, you're going to be less able to contain and respond to incidents when they do occur. So that's a mechanism for prevention as well as containment and response. And it's one of those more advanced capabilities, but it's really important to be able to do that. The only way you can get there is by laying the foundation of having that good asset inventory and being able to know at any given point in time what devices are connected to your network. Really important to be able to do. The other thing which is also really important to be able to do that serves as a foundation of all this stuff is the principle of least functionality. And this principle is one of those core security disciplines that every security practitioner will hammer into the heads of their IT teams or their clients if they're a consultant. You want to configure your devices and configure your network to support the minimum functionality that you need in order to be able to do your job. So for your business to operate, there's some set of services, some set of ports and protocols that are absolutely required in order to be able to function, and that is all that should be allowed to operate on that network. You shouldn't be exposing stuff that's not actively being used, because every one of those is a potential entry point and a potential attack vector that you've then got to control. So the principle of least functionality is the minimization of that threat surface. And that's really beneficial because you have limited resources, you have limited time, and security controls can only do so much. If you limit the potential impact or the potential services that somebody could exploit, you're going to end up making your job easier in the long run, and then the rest of the stuff that we're going to talk about today becomes that much easier as well. So with all that said, what are the characteristics of a secure network? And I'm going to touch back on that principle of least functionality throughout this because it's really endemic to the entire conversation. So the characteristics of a secure network, building upon that principle of least functionality, begin with trust zones. Trust zones, we'll talk a little bit more about them later on, but they're a way of limiting flow of information from one segment of your network to another. That deals very specifically with the internal network as well as your external security posture, so we'll talk about internal network segmentation a little bit as well. Of course, the security controls themselves, like IDS, IPS, firewalls, secure DNS, log management, and defense in depth, are all riding upon your network and all have to be configured correctly in order to support a secure posture, and we'll talk about each of those as well. So let's see, what exactly is a trust zone? A trust zone is a separate network segment on your network that you basically put a wrapper around some set of services or some set of assets that you're trying to control access to. There are some really good examples of what a trust zone is, but basically all you're trying to do is minimize the amount of traffic that can flow from one level of trust to another. So what I mean by that is a server that hosts a very sensitive database has a higher level of criticality and a lower level of trust of what sort of information should be transiting that sort of network. There should be a different security context applied to that versus a workstation space where someone may be able to browse the internet and potentially download some malicious file or something like that. Those levels of trust zones, implementing those in your network will go a very long way to helping you contain incidents when they happen. Also, not just from the containment perspective, but from a prevention perspective as well, implementing trust zones will make it so that the vast majority of risks are simply taken off the table because they're not, the devices that they would impact are not accessible to a malicious person. Really important to be able to do that. Some really common examples of trust zones are the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, core server VLAN, in which your core infrastructure sits, things like your Active Directory servers, your database servers, things like that, and then your user space VLAN. And VLANs are actually the perfect way to implement trust zones throughout your environment. It's not necessarily required to have separate physical network infrastructure to be able to do trust zones. However, some very high security environments do separate physical networks. Thinking specifically of, in the government, there's a concept of classified versus unclassified. And unclassified data, classified data simply cannot exist on an unclassified network. And the way that that's done is by a separate network that handles all classified information. For you non-government folks in the audience, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's a huge cost to actually implement that. But the same sort of concept can be applied through VLANing. And if you're unfamiliar with VLANing, that's a great way to provide some additional granularity of control over what sort of data flows can happen within your network. So let's talk a little bit more about the DMZ. What exactly is a DMZ? I would hope that all of you in the audience have implemented a DMZ, protecting yourselves from the vast majority of threats out in the wild. If you haven't, I can't recommend it enough. This isn't something that's optional. If you have any sort of service that faces the internet, and you do, it needs to be sitting in a DMZ. That's the only real way that you can protect your internal assets from outside attack. And unfortunately, while this concept is kind of it's somewhat basic from a security perspective, we see clients where we do risk assessments that have very flat networks that really don't have the capability to screen information or traffic from the internet all the way into the inside. So you've got workstations, you've got directory servers, you've got application and database servers that are all publicly accessible. And that's a really, really dangerous situation to be in. So the DMZ is what helps you segregate those services which must be exposed to the internet from those which should never be exposed to the internet. It's a screened subnet, which basically means that there's a subnet that on which your internet-facing services sit, that certain amounts of traffic are allowed into that DMZ, and then certain amounts of traffic from the DMZ are allowed into your internal environment. Enables, again, that concept of least functionality. It also enforces the security concepts of least privilege, so that a person who's not privileged on a device can't even see that it exists. It helps you minimize your internet footprint, which again, you want to try to minimize as much as you possibly can the threat vectors, the attack surface that a bad guy can use against you. Again, that concept of least functionality. And enables also you to minimize the risk of the data leakage. If where your sensitive data sits is not even visible to the internet, then you have a much lower likelihood of data leaking from that out to the internet. Also, the DMZ really simplifies logging and monitoring, and we'll talk more about that later. But what I want to also give you guys is a visual depiction of how this actually works. So I'm going to walk through from the outside all the way back into the inside to explain how traffic flows should work in a DMZ and how they should be segregated from the internal network. So out here on this external client, this is the internet, right? This is where your users or your customers or your business partners sit and access you guys. You have a perimeter firewall which blocks some amount of traffic from the outside in. And then this section here, this is really your DMZ. This is where your web servers sit that your users need to be able to access. This is where your application servers sit that your web servers need to talk to be able to service these guys. But critically, this is not where your database servers sit. Your database servers are in your back end, and very, very minimal traffic is allowed to actually transact between those. And in fact, there should never be traffic from the outside all the way into the database. There should be some launch pad or some checkpoint between the outside and the very far inside that that traffic is reviewed, monitored, logged, and either blocked or alerted upon if something actually needs to be. The transaction between the database and the user really needs to follow this path. It needs to go, the user makes a request to the web server. The web server processes that request and says, I need some information from this application server. The application server says, I need some information from the database server. The database server then passes that information through the internal firewall out to the application server. Application server processes that through the web server, and that goes out to the outside. Now that might sound complicated, but to the end user, that is entirely transparent. In fact, very minimal latency if it's architected correctly. What that really does is it minimizes the potential for this bad guy out here to use something like a SQL injection attack or a code injection attack to pull information out of your database, because there's going to be multiple checkpoints along the way that we can apply some security controls that are going to minimize the potential for that actually happening. And we'll talk about each of those controls a little bit later. But really, again, the stuff that there should be very minimal things in your DMZ, and the rest of that should be stored in the back end. Later on, I'm going to talk about internal network segmentation, and we'll review this a little bit more at that point in time as well. But you'll see here that we've got internal clients. These are your users segregated from the space where your servers sit. Your core server VLAN should be separate from your internal users, and that's actually not as common as what it should be. We perform a lot of risk assessments where, again, maybe our clients have implemented a DMZ properly, but that internal network segmentation has not been done correctly. And it's really important to be able to do that to minimize the potential for a very common attack, which is let's say a phishing attack or a drive-by download which drops some malware or botnet on this device here, from expanding out from there and affecting your server environment. If you do this internal network segmentation, you're going to minimize the possibility of that to actually happen. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the question you might be asking to yourself is, well, okay, based on that, what should be in a DMZ and what shouldn't be in a DMZ? And that's really what is the most important part of this. Services that you should typically find in your DMZ are anything that's HTTP or HTTPS, so your web services. Anything that's forward-facing that you need to give information out to a user out on the internet, that should be there, just simply from a web processing perspective. SMTP, this is your mail server, simple message transfer protocol, that must be in your DMZ in order for you to actually be able to send email in and out. If you have that in your internal network and you're just routing that directly out, that's a dangerous situation. That internal SMTP server could be used to forward spam to everybody in your network, and you don't want that to happen. You also might typically have an SFTP server in your DMZ. That's the Secure File Transfer Protocol. So that's a service, and you'll note that I didn't say FTP. Do not use FTP. Use SFTP. If you're using FTP, you're transmitting credentials in clear text, and it's a dangerous situation. You might even be allowing anonymous logins, which is a great way for the bad guy to have, awful things stored on your network, like child pornography. We see that quite often. An anonymous FTP server that's actually hosting, kiddie porn, and of course it's unknown to the organization themselves, but because they've not architected their network correctly, they're actually liable for that. So SFTP is something that if you have to transfer maybe large files with a partner or some customer organization, SFTP in your DMZ is a good way to do that. Public-facing applications, if you've got some web application, again, that should be in your DMZ, and there should be a DNS server in your DMZ as well. that DNS server should be communicating out to your upstream provider. Your ISP has a DMZ service as well. Your internal client should not be communicating directly with the external DNS server. They should be communicating with an internal DNS server, which then talks out. And that gives you some additional control over how domain name resolution actually works. DNS can actually be pretty easily compromised, and if you're doing it insecurely, you can end up being phished more easily. You can end up having malware infections able to operate without any sort of ability to detect them, because basically you're being fooled into thinking you're communicating with a known good source when in fact it's known bad. So services that should never, ever, ever be in a DMZ are your databases. You really do not want to have databases that store sensitive information in a DMZ. It's unfortunately common. I see it time and time again that people put MS SQL Server or Oracle or some other database in the DMZ. It's a risky proposition to do that, because if it's in the DMZ, then it's likely that an outsider can see that that device exists by doing a port scan. If you're offering up the MS SQL Server ports to the outside world, then you're very, very at risk of things like that MS SQL Server slammer worm that everybody got a couple years back because networks were improperly configured. And it's very, very easy to start pulling information out of those databases if they sit in that space. Those databases really need to be very highly protected, and traffic to and from them needs to be locked down to the absolute bare minimum. Another thing that should not be in your DMZ is remote desktop. Now, a lot of organizations, again, that we talk to, put an RDP server in their DMZ to give kind of a poor man's VPN service, so that an outside user can access some internal server to do some remote administration. The problem is that's really easily abused. The bad guys know, exactly what port that runs on, which is 3389. So if you look at your firewall and you're allowing 3389 in from the internet, it's a bad situation to be in. And it enables them to do things like brute force authentication attacks against your internal servers. And it's another opportunity for a bad guy to get into your network. You really don't want to have remote desktop in your DMZ. The secure way to do remote access is to have a VPN service or a VPN client installed on those remote systems, which connects back, creates a secure tunnel into your internal network, and then allows that user to then, in the context as an internal user, access those services remote into whatever services or servers they need to administer. You really don't want to be allowing RDP in from the internet. Also, you should never have in your DMZ internal authentication servers. So things like an Active Directory server should never be in the DMZ. That services authentication requests from the outside. Even something like a Radius server, which might be allowing remote authentication for your network devices, that again should not be in the DMZ. Those are protected services that, should a bad guy gain control or a foothold on them, can do things like privilege escalation, can create user accounts in your environment that then they can leverage to maintain access, and then pivot out from there to compromise other devices. Those devices, again, those services really need to be inside the network and need to be very closely scrutinized in terms of what sort of traffic is allowed to get to them. And the way that actually is effectuated is through internal network segmentation. So what is internal network segmentation? Take the idea of a DMZ and apply that to your internal network. Your DMZ, again, is designed to minimize the amount of traffic, minimize the amount of communications that are able to be transacted with the servers that are only the ones that need to be speaking to the internet. Same concept internally can be applied to your core servers. There's actually very few people in your environment that really need to have direct communication with the database server. In fact, probably only a couple, and those are likely to be your database admins. Other users really shouldn't even be able to see that those exist on the network. So if somebody were to fire up a port scanner or something like that, maybe a packet sniffer like Wireshark or Nmap to enumerate what sort of services are available on your network, they shouldn't even be able to see those servers even exist. The way that that's done is through VLANing. So your users exist in an entirely different VLAN from where your servers are, and the access control list, or ACL, between your user space and your internal core server space is very, very minimal. It allows very little traffic from only certain devices, and of course, again, the way that you can do that, where you have to start is having a good inventory and so that you know what users in your IT department need access to what servers within your core services or core server network. That allows you to be able to do that stuff. You really only want to allow traffic from, again, those devices that absolutely need access to those servers that host the sensitive information. Things like your Active Directory server, of course, everybody on the network is going to need to be able to authenticate to it. But there's only a couple of ports that really are used in that authentication process. And so the ACL can be configured to allow traffic from any device on the network to that server, but only on those 2 ports. And that's a way that, again, you can apply that concept of least functionality and least privilege across your internal network. Again, you really want to only grant access to the resources people absolutely need to be able to do their job. Somebody in your accounting department probably doesn't need access to your credit card database or your sensitive security database in your database server. So block the traffic. It's not necessary and creates risk that you may not be able to control otherwise. The other thing, again, that internal network segmentation allows you to do is it really builds a containment and quarantine capability into the network itself. That's going to facilitate incident response in a much more expedient manner than what you can do without it. Think about it this way. If a user at their desktop browses an inappropriate website or accidentally downloads a piece of malware or even gets phished, if you have a very flat network, that piece of malware may be programmed to self-propagate across any device it can see on the network, which means it can very quickly spread from that user's device to other users' devices and then to your server farm. Your server farm, of course, is where your sensitive information is housed, and if a piece of malware gets on there, then next thing you know, you're going to be in the headlines for a massive data breach. And internal network segmentation will allow you to, first off, identify that device has been compromised. Hopefully you have good logging and monitoring, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you're able to identify that device has been compromised, you can apply that port security protocol, block traffic from that device, or if things get really bad and it spreads to multiple users in a very fast manner, you can take that entire segment of the network off until it gets cleaned up and contained. That it might sound like an extreme reaction, but if you're in a very high criticality environment, a high sensitivity environment, and you've got to take immediate action, then taking the user space offline is preferable to having your sensitive security database or your customer information compromised and put up on paste bin. That's going to allow you much more a quick manner of containing and responding to incidents. The other thing it allows you to do is it establishes a choke point on the network so that all of the traffic from that user space needs to go through some checkpoint before it goes anywhere, whether that's to the internal server farm or out to the internet. That choke point is where you can do that that internal monitoring and that internal control. That internal monitoring is so important that what's called east-west traffic between your user space and your internal network server space is where you're going to be able to pick up that insider threat. So if you have a malicious insider, or you have somebody who's again made a mistake and clicked the wrong link in an email and has been phished, that internal device is going to be trying to probe for services that are available. A lot of times what happens is they'll run a port scan, and this is all purely automated. The malware will look for things like port 1433, which is your MS SQL server, and look for those services that are available. If it finds them, it's going to deploy some exploit technology to go and try to pop that database and start siphoning information out of it. The ability to pick that up is going to be it's what separates the high security and the mature and effective security programs from the baseline minimum compliance sort of environment. That granularity of monitoring and control is really going to make the difference between an organization that has one device compromised via a phishing attack and their entire system compromised and data breach that results in client notifications and the FBI calling you up. Really important, can't stress it enough. Take the concept of least privilege and least functionality and apply it to your internal network. In addition to that, so we mentioned the internal monitoring and control. How is that actually done? That monitoring at that choke point, you basically are going to implement a couple different technologies which will help you do that. The choke point itself is usually protected either by a firewall or by an access control list and a VLAN. And additionally, if you apply or if you place sensors in the correct places in your network, you can apply some additional high granularity monitoring and even prevention if you're of a mind to use an IPS versus an IDS. But these two technologies I'll talk a little bit about. If you haven't deployed these in your environment, there's probably significant benefits that you can get from using these sorts of technologies. But again, they've got to be done correctly, and they've got to be layered on top of a network that's been architected in a manner that is secure. So an IDS is an intrusion detection system. There's a couple different types of intrusion detection systems. One is network-based, and one is host-based. Network-based is a device, an appliance that hooks into your network at a strategic point and is basically watching traffic as it goes by. And that is designed to look for malicious packets or things that match a signature or maybe are just different than what has been seen before, if they're pure behavior-based or anomaly-based. They're usually passive in that they're not able to block traffic, but they are able to generate alerts that your administrators can then take action on. It's really important to be able to see that malicious traffic. And in fact, a lot of times it's better to use an IDS than an IPS for a couple of key reasons. It really depends upon your environment and what sort of security posture and risk tolerance you guys have. IPS is going to take action in an automated manner. And when architected correctly, that can work really well. But when improperly architected or when those systems are just kind of set and forget and plugged in and nobody's actually nurturing them and maintaining them, I've seen situations I like to call a runaway IPS. Basically, an IPS, they're not supposed to but can fail closed. And what that means is if an IPS goes offline and all of the traffic is being pushed through that IPS, basically you take the entire network offline. And of course, that's an undesirable situation. But both of those systems, they require you to implement them at particular points in the network. And the question I'll ask is, where would you install yours? If you think about your network, how it's architected, hopefully you have some of those internal segmentations and you have a DMZ. Where would you put those sensors? And I'm going to give you a couple examples of what typically works in environments that we've seen before. So I'll start with the IDS on this side over here. So you've got the internet out here where you've got your bad guys that are trying to gain access to you. They need to transit through this firewall and then gain access to some system inside the environment from there. So you want to be able to pick that traffic up in a couple different places. First off, if you're only going to do one, I recommend you put the IDS within the firewall rather than without the firewall, simply because the firewall is going to do a job of blocking traffic. It's useful to see what people are trying to do against you, but your firewall logs should actually tell you quite a bit of that. If you're going to do both, then it's certainly useful. It's kind of a belt and suspenders approach. But if you can only do one, then I would recommend you put it inside the environment, simply because why? It's an intrusion detection system. So you're trying to detect intrusions. The intrusion happens behind the firewall. You want to see what your firewall has missed. The unfortunate part about that is by the time it gets here, that's an intrusion, and you've got then to take response action and containment action to be able to do something about it. Again, this device is only going to be watching traffic as it goes by. It's going to be generating an alert back to some systems administrator who's then going to have to take action upon it. But it's only going to watch it as it goes by. This needs to be coupled with, and so first, this is a network-based IDS that's connected to the network, and it's doing traffic monitoring from that perspective. Should be coupled with a host-based IDS, which is the piece of software that sits out here on each of these devices that generates alarms when it sees traffic and sees threats that are impacting that specific device. Those two in tandem are defense in depth, or at least components of defense in depth, and in my opinion, absolutely required. You've got to be doing both. So don't think of that as a one or the other. Now that's an IDS. How does an IPS different? So an IPS, again, is an intrusion prevention system, and this is usually inline, if you recall earlier. So inline means traffic is passing through it. So you've got the outside, the internet where your bad guys are sitting, trying to get to your internal network. That traffic in an IPS environment passes through this device, gets scrubbed for threat signatures. If it sees something that matches a signature for a piece of malware or a virus or some code injection attack or things like that, it's going to drop the packet. It's going to say, this is bad traffic. I know it's bad traffic. I'm going to drop it to the floor, and that's never going to get to the endpoint. So that's obviously desirable. Again, typically, simply because that traffic is passing through this, if you look at this diagram here, what this really is a single point of failure. So this really, if you're going to do an inline IPS, really needs to be a high availability pair, such that if one device fails, you're guaranteed you're not going to take your own network offline and basically denial of service yourself. That's obviously not something you want to have happen. This diagram also demonstrates internal network segmentation in addition to just this DMZ concept. What you've got here is an IDS between your workstation environment and your sensitive financial information, so that if traffic were to transit from this workstation over here, you've got a point where you can do some granular inspection on that sort of traffic and pick out if this device is trying to do a port scan, or if the SQL slammer worm is attempting to gain access to this payroll server and pull out information or even inject new records into it. That additional granularity, that additional monitoring capability is going to do volumes for you to be able to more properly and adequately secure your internal network. Super important that you do that. So that's, again, the difference between an IDS and an IPS. I often get asked which I prefer. I don't like to give blanket recommendations for either of these technologies. It really does depend upon the environment of the client and how much risk tolerance they have, and also the size of the team. So if there's a large team of actual security engineers that are certified and experienced and know how to do containment and response, then an IDS might be my preference, simply because it's going to generate alerts that need to be analyzed and investigated, need to be scrubbed for false positives, and an experienced human needs to do that. And then that human is going to take appropriate action. An IPS will do all that stuff automatically, and there's opportunities for that technology to go awry. So I guess if really pushed, I tend to prefer an IDS layered with some human analysis that's able to take action once that bad traffic has been identified. But again, it requires experienced people that know what they're looking at from an IDS log perspective. So that's IDS IPS. What about the domain name system? So what is DNS? DNS is the service that resolves URL like google.com to an IP address, and that IP address is what you're actually communicating with. DNS actually has some flaws that were, the past couple of years, highly attacked and highly leveraged by the bad guys to be able to do some pretty nasty things. Good DNS architecture can actually prevent that manipulation and prevent you from finding yourself in a situation where, if I can trick you into thinking google.com actually points to my IP address as the bad guy, I can intercept your traffic. And google.com might expose what you're searching, but expand that or extrapolate that same paradigm to something like a financial transaction. If I can trick you into thinking that I'm Bank of America or whatever bank or credit union it is that you work with, I can intercept that traffic. I can maybe even take over that account. And that actually is more common than you might think. So in addition to the privacy concerns that are obvious by being able to spoof an address and trick you into thinking I'm somebody I'm not, there are significant security concerns from a transactional and a financial standpoint as well. So what is good DNS architecture? So I took this diagram from the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Trusted Internet Connection DNS architecture. Trusted Internet Connection, it's called TIC. It's the government mandate that all federal organizations are required to implement, which basically specifies how DNS needs to be architected, how internet connections need to be implemented within the government to minimize their footprint. TIC really is the government's application of that least functionality and least privilege paradigm, which I talked about earlier. So a good DNS architecture involves 3 tiers, and I'll talk about each of these tiers independently here. So tier 1 is located on your internal network. It's the internal client's main source of information for what URL maps to what IP address. So that when an internal user on their laptop or on their desktop makes a request to go to CNN.com, that request transits from their desktop to the internal DNS server. That internal DNS server then says, I know who CNN.com is, and I'm going to give you back the IP address for that, or if it doesn't know who CNN.com is, it's going to transfer that request to the next level of authority, which is Tier 2. Tier 2 is located in your DMZ. This is a server that is sitting out there that's really acting as kind of the proxy between your internal system and the internet. And your internal DNS server is going to say, I don't know who CNN.com is, I better ask the next level of authority. That information then gets transmitted to the DMZ server. The DMZ server says, well, I know who CNN.com is, here's the IP address for that. And if it does know, then that's the end of the conversation, and then that user, then that information, or that traffic goes out to CNN.com. If, on the other hand, that DNS server in your DMZ doesn't know who CNN.com is, it then transits that information outside your organization, preferably to your upstream DNS provider, usually your ISP, and preferably not to somebody that some external entity that's not your ISP. Simply because, again, if a DNS database is compromised and I can fool you into thinking you're communicating with somebody that you're not, then it gives me a perfect opportunity to intercept traffic and to take over your accounts and things like that. So again, 3 tiers. Internal should only be talking to the internal Tier 1. Tier 1 should be talking to Tier 2. And then Tier 2 should be talking out to Tier 3 if it can't resolve it itself. Really important that this is done correctly, and it's actually not terribly common that it is done correctly. In fact, I'd bet that most of you in the audience don't have a proper 3-tier DNS architecture in your environment. Again, this is a great way to implement that idea of least privilege within your internal networks. Of course, all this stuff is great, but one thing that's really critical when you're thinking about defense in depth and you're thinking about secure network architecture is log management. You've got security appliances all over your network. You've got sensors deployed at appropriate places. You've got internal network segmentation, but you really need to be able to detect bad stuff when it's happening, and then use that information as a means of looking back in time at what's happened on your network in the event an incident does occur. You want to be able to do that forensic analysis, and log management is really the only way you're going to be able to do that. Each device in your network is generating some kind of event log, whether that's a Windows desktop or a critical Linux server that's hosting a database. Every one of those things has some security relevancy and some event information which can be used to develop a picture of what's happening in your environment at any given point in time. That situational awareness is imperative to be able to do the containment and response, which I talked about earlier. If you're going to be able to contain an incident, you first must be able to detect that incident. And log management's a mechanism that will help you get there. You need to be able to pull that information into a central repository, because a lot of times the malware that we see on a day-in, day-out basis, one of the things that it's configured to do is blow away the local event logs, so that it's basically hiding its tracks. And if you're not doing central log management and a centralized log repository, you're going to lose that ability to detect that incident has happened, or look back in time and perform some forensic analysis against it. So it's really important you're doing that. Centralized administration for all the things we talked about is very important for that same reason. If you don't have that centralized ability to do log aggregation, to do security analysis, to do systems administration, you don't have centralized ability to do that, it's going to make you less efficient. It's going to make it more likely for human error to create security situations where devices are configured insecurely or are managed insecurely. So it's really important to be able to do that from a centralized standpoint. All of that ends up boiling down to defense in depth. And I'm sure everyone in the audience has heard of this term before. Defense in depth is really the layering of multiple different security controls on top of one another to provide that chain of countermeasures, which should one fail, another should be able to pick up the ball and help protect you. So I look at this from 2 perspectives. You have to protect the network, and you have to protect the hosts that are actually on the network. So protecting the network starts, step 1 is the network has to be engineered correctly. All the stuff that we talked about today absolutely must be there in order for the rest of this stuff to actually function correctly. You can have all of these other controls, but if you haven't implemented a secure network architecture, they're almost useless. It's really easy to compromise a network that's been improperly secured, even if you've got antivirus, anti-malware, and you've got a firewall. If you're not properly implementing segmentation inside the network, your antivirus system. In fact, there's a quote from Symantec's AVP that basically said our product is only going to be effective 45% of the time. So that other 55% of the time, should something slip past a signature database, your secure network architecture is what's going to prevent that from rapidly expanding out and compromising other devices in your environment. Of course, you have to have a firewall or multiple firewalls if you've got that internal segmentation down correctly. You really should have an IDS, IPS, and you really must be doing logging and monitoring. All of those things are going to add up to a much more secure network than if you don't have any one of those things, and certainly if you don't have any of them. On the host side, of course, you've got to have the antivirus, anti-malware. It might be only effective 45% of the time, but that 45% of the time is going to go a long way to protecting you against the most common stuff. You should also be doing integrity monitoring. I didn't talk too much about this, but integrity monitoring is ensuring that things like your system files are not being changed. So like a configuration for SSH on a Linux server, that should very rarely change. And if it does, you should know that that has changed. Your registry keys in your Windows servers should very rarely change. And if they do, that's actually a pretty good indicator of compromise. A lot of malware will inject new security keys into your registry, and being able to detect those is part of what a good host-based IDS should be able to do for you. Configuration management is along those same sort of lines. Being able to detect configuration changes to devices, things like firewalls or routers, switches, etc. If you can't detect that they're changing, then you're in kind of an unknown security state. And of course, that logging and monitoring is endemic to both sides of the house. Defense in depth really is a cornerstone of information security and assurance. It's equally as important as that concept of least privilege, the concept of least functionality, that concept of need to know, and defense in depth all go hand in hand to preventing the vast majority of threats in an environment. You're only as strong as your weakest link, and unfortunately, we as the good guys have to be right 100% of the time. The bad guys just have to get it right once. They exploit one weakness, and it's game over. That's where the secure network is going to help you contain the inevitable. And unfortunately, I have to say that a compromise is inevitable. It's very, very likely that a user is going to accidentally click on a link in an email. Very, very likely that they may browse a website that, unbeknownst to them, has been compromised itself and downloads a piece of malware into their environment through no action on their own. That's a very likely scenario to happen. We see it every day. A secure network is going to help you detect when that does happen, contain it so that it doesn't expand and become a data breach, and then respond to the incident to eradicate the infection point where it actually sits. So that's the extent of the content that I wanted to talk about today. We do have about 10 minutes left for some questions. So I'm going to open the floor to see if we do have any questions out there. And it looks like we do have a couple.
Okay, so we've got a few questions that have populated here. First one, how would this apply to BYOD? Is there anything we can do from an infrastructure standpoint?
Yeah, that's a good question. So BYOD is bring your own desktop. And actually a lot of organizations are moving to a paradigm where they allow employees to bring their own laptop or bring their own mobile phone or iPad or tablet and connect back to enterprise systems to do their daily operations. On the surface sounds like a really good way to minimize IT costs because you're not having to purchase devices for your employees. But of course, there are some pretty significant security concerns with that. If people are bringing their own devices, how are you able to inspect them for things like antivirus signatures? Are you able to verify that they've been securely configured? All of those sorts of things are concerns that keep CISOs up at night when their CFO says, we're going to implement BYOD to drive our costs down. So the question, is there anything we can do from an infrastructure standpoint? The answer, absolutely yes. That internal network segmentation that I talked about earlier is a great way to help enforce some security controls over what is effectively an untrusted device. If you think about those trust zones we talked about earlier, a device that's brought in from the outside that an employee owns, that they may, their child may be on at night browsing Facebook or playing video games on, that's an untrusted device, and so should absolutely not be in the same internal network segment as your trusted devices, where you've got your sensitive security information, you've got databases, you've got internal authentication protocols, things like that. Applying that concept of internal network segmentation makes it so that the risk of allowing your employees to bring their own devices is minimized. Should that employee bring a device which maybe has a piece of malware on it, that's not going to be able to expand out from there and propagate across your network to your critical servers inside your environment. Also, because you've applied that internal network segmentation, when that botnet that's installed on that device your employee brought into the environment tries to beacon out to the command and control server out in Estonia, you're going to be able to pick that up at multiple points across the network. You're going to be able to see that traffic leave the internal network segment where your BYOD space is. You're going to see that hit your firewall protecting your DMZ from your internal network, and then you're going to see it hit the firewall on its way out. Each point in time gives you an opportunity to learn something about what's happening there, and being able to detect that when it happens is what's going to allow you to prevent the traffic from actually reaching that command and control server. If you can prevent that from happening, then that guy who's running the botnet is never going to see that device exists inside your network, and it's not going to be able to do things like open up ports and have back-channel communication that's going to allow it to exfiltrate data. So absolutely, yes, there are things that infrastructure can do to help you implement BYOD securely. A very good question.
All right, our next question here is, I'm confused about something. Can I architect my network infrastructure to detect malicious insiders? How so, or is this more of a tools issue?
Okay, so malicious insiders, yeah. So in fact, it's actually a very similar answer to the BYOD. If you think about that untrusted device that is potentially hosting malware or hosting some piece of software which allows that person to do network scanning or something like that, that's a malicious insider ultimately. Even if that user that's using that, again, the BYOD example, that device isn't malicious themselves, unfortunately that device is. In the actual case of a malicious user, someone on your internal network which is trying to do you harm, having that internal network segmentation is going to allow you to pick up when that guy or that malicious actor is doing things like scanning or doing things like trying to inject code or even pull information out of a database. That concept of least functionality and least privilege that I talked about earlier, that's really going to apply very, very well to this. Because that malicious insider may be trying to probe a database to see what information they can pull out of it, and if you've properly architected your network, they should not even be able to get to that database server to be able to actually pull information out of it. They should have to go through a couple of hops where you can detect that they're trying to do something like a code injection, or that that traffic simply blocked, that there's not a way to pull data from that system out to user space, except for, again, the very few that actually need to be able to do that. So absolutely. There are definitely tools also to get to these. This is more of a tools issue component there. Tools also that can help detect those malicious insiders. But again, if you haven't properly architected your network, you could have all the tools in the world. It's going to be much easier to circumvent those countermeasures if your network's not implemented in a way that enforces those trust zones and enforces that concept of least privilege and least functionality. Good question, though.
Okay, our next question is, so where should I begin?
Yeah, right, that's the question I get all the time. Where do I start with this? There are a lot of kind of advanced ideas here. In my opinion, you must be able to identify devices in your network. You've got to start with a good inventory. You should know every device that's connected to your network at all times. And there are technologies that you can use to implement that, but it really begins with kind of that current state assessment. Where am I today? Now, some people we talk to, maybe they're very versed in information technology, but security is kind of a niche discipline for them. In those cases, I would recommend have a secure subject matter expert perform a current state assessment or a risk assessment against your environment. help you, devise a secure network architecture that's going to work for your operation and give you a roadmap of how to implement that over the course of perhaps 12 to 18 months or longer, depending upon how far off you are. But definitely want to start with being able to identify devices in your network. That inventory, again, is going to enable you to do things like port security, things like active device control, minimizing the devices that are connected to your network, and things like that. But I would certainly recommend talking to a qualified security assessor to do an architecture assessment against your environment if you don't have that sort of skill in-house.
Okay, our next question comes from Sunny. Will properly structuring my network help me meet PCI DSS or HIPAA compliance?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. There are components of the PCI Data Security Standard and HIPAA which deal specifically with the things that we talked about, minimizing ports and protocols, and enforcing some of the administrative controls in HIPAA that basically, again, prohibit people from taking actions that they shouldn't be. That's really what all it boils down to, and not just PCI or HIPAA. Things like the National Credit Union Administration or Association has a set of controls which are really similar. FISMA, same sort of thing. Basically, any of those security compliance mandates or regulations, they all require the things that we talked about today. Whether that be secure DNS or the implementation of a properly configured DNZ, or a firewall which minimizes the ports and protocols that are allowed to exist, or the types of services that are in your DMZ. Those are key components of all of those regulations. So absolutely yes, your auditor, when they come in to look at your PCI compliance self-attestation, they're going to want to see a network diagram. And if that network diagram is entirely flat and it's obvious that traffic from the internet would be able to get to anything in your environment, you're going to fail. So no question, a properly architected network it'll be a requirement for you to achieve compliance with those regulations that in the environment you work in.
Are there any other questions from the audience? All right. Okay, if there's no other questions at this time, we're going to end the webinar. By all means, if you have any questions that come to your mind afterwards, by all means, feel free to reach out to us. Paul had his contact information listed earlier, and let me just click the next slide here. And our main number is here, as well as our website. And with that, I'm going to conclude the webinar. Remember, we will be emailing you a copy of this webinar as well as the slides. Thank you.
So thanks, everybody, for your time. And again, please feel free to reach out if you do have follow-up questions.